behavior modification. I'm not certain it's ever really the purview of a manager to modify the behavior of an employee because of the fact that they really can't. They can build barriers, they can guide, they can coach, but the person is always responsible for their own actions. Managers do not have to sit down and own the behavior of a misbehaving employee. They need to give that employee clear direction as to what is expected of them, and that employee is supposed to sit down and take care of it themselves. So the idea of you trying to modify the behavior, you do not have that power. You really don't. If they really go over here, you can set parameters, and the ultimate thing is termination if the behavior continues in an inappropriate way. But let's go through and look as to how we sit down there and provide guidelines for the employee and make certain that they're involved with the process. The aspect of reinforcement and motivation, we're going to look at 4 types of behavior modification: positive, negative, extinction, and punishment. Using behavior modification to improve employees, we'll look at a couple things. First of all, positive reinforcement. Giving people praise is always a good thing. Now, that being said, praise in public, discipline in private. Praise in public, discipline in private. Now, that being said, there are some cases where you have to deal with negative behavior in a public setting. One time I had to take over a brand new group. They were really highly skilled operating engineers that really managed giant systems at 5 different colleges. I was the operations director. So with that, my very first meeting, I had one of the op engineers says, well, they finally have a bean counter in charge. Your skill set, you don't even know half of what I do. My response, all of a sudden, I have 12 employees sitting in front of me. I have an outburst from one person that, of all people, should probably not have done that. And I says, you know what? All 12 of you really do know more than I do about the technical parts of the job. But I do know how to sit down there and pay attention to expectations, behavior, and what good performance is. And you and I will be having to talk about my expectations for you and your conduct in public meetings right after this one. The room went deathly quiet. Yes, I had to deal with that moment. In that second, I could not let that behavior continue, or I would have had a miserable time for the next couple of years managing that group. All of a sudden, from that point forward, everybody sat down there and they were on their best behavior because of the fact is they knew I had the capacity to deal with that behavior in the ultimate methodology. So the concept is extinction and then also punishment. So we really talked about that aspect, and sometimes you have to sit down and take a solid stand. That's a rare occasion though. For the most part, you sit down there, you praise somebody. I want to thank Margaret for doing this over here. I cannot believe the quality of work that she's been doing. Thank you, Margaret, very much. You do the positive behavior in public, but you got to be careful. Sometimes people don't like to have public praise. So know the people that you're working with, because if they're so introverted that they don't want to have public praise, you better know about that. Be careful. I've already given you illustrations on that. Negative reinforcement. Really, if you bring them in the office saying, okay, here's my expectations of this over here, and this is what I saw. Can you correct me that I see something wrong, or tell me what's going on here? And then you have a dialogue with them. Clear, honest behavior. Stop the wrong things happening as they're happening, and don't let them go on and on and on, because then you're a weak leader. You need to pay attention to the behavior that's happening in the workplace. If they're not doing the job well, most people don't mean to do the job poorly. They don't know better. It's going to kind of depend upon your personal expectations of them as an employee. Extinction, now one of the things we want to talk about is the aspect of termination. If you terminate an employee, just so you know, here's how the psychology works. The threat of termination is more powerful than the actual termination. Soon as you do that, well, they fired Joe last week and he's out right now. Joe's out there and he's actually doing pretty good. He's making more money. Really? He's making more money? Yeah. Sometimes the threat of it once it happens, people realize that the threat really sits down, and that may lead to other opportunities or whatever it is. You don't really want to go there if you don't have to, but sometimes you do. But be cautious on it, because extinction, it can be very difficult. Punishment also weakens the behavior, but you sometimes have to do that as well. Here's the thing called due process. You need to take this and put this in your notes. This is a big deal. Yes, it's here in our class, but yes, it's real in the real world as well, because of the fact that if you don't follow a due process and you terminate somebody, 2/3 of all lawsuits between employers and employees come from how they were treated on their way out the door. Not necessarily the termination, but how they were treated. And sometimes people treat them poorly. You are not to sit down and insult and denigrate the person. You need to deal with the behavior. Pay attention to, really, this is what I saw, and this is inappropriate in the workplace, so I want it corrected. Now, first of all, you tell them. Bring them in the office privately, and you talk to them privately. You need a verbal. You can do a verbal correction a couple ways. You do a verbal correction, make certain nobody else is around, and it's one-on-one. Here's my expectations. I thought your behavior in the meeting today was a little bit over the top. I did not expect you to be as aggressive as you were. I really don't want to see that happen again. Okay. Then sometimes you need to sit down there and follow that up with an email. I want to sit down and reiterate what we just talked about today because of this. Now, you also may want to do this as well. That's one option. That's stronger than just the verbal, because then you're following up and they know you're documenting the behavior. You can always give a verbal and go back to your office and you click, click, click on your computer. You write what's called a memorandum of recollection. You write down what happened on that date. On this date, I talked to Joe and I told him that I did not appreciate his behavior and that I expected him to be less aggressive in future meetings, and you put the date. Now, the reason you're doing that is because of the fact that if that behavior occurs again, you may go back and say do a written warning, and you say, on this date, I want to refer back to, I warned you about this behavior, and you said you wouldn't do it again, and it's happened again. I now am sitting there, this is actually a written warning or a written reprimand, however you want to phrase it, that if I have it happen again, additional behavior modification or additional reprimands will be forthcoming up to and including termination. You put that all in there and you start building the case in the personnel file. If you sat down there and gave a verbal warning, you can refer back to that at some future date. And that's why you want to save the date either on your personal notes or on an email that you sent to address them for that issue. And then the next step, if you have another problem, the next step is suspension. And you can do one of two ways: a short suspension for 2 or 3 days, or a long suspension for 30 days. Then you have had a verbal, then you've had something in writing, then you have a suspension. If they do it again, out the door. That being said, it's all so much easier said than done. I had to terminate an employee, and I went into the superintendent's office of public schools, because at that point I was working in a K-12 district, and I'm sitting down with the superintendent. He says, if everything you said, David, is true, then we have to go through termination here. So you investigate that, but I want to let you know that if we go to termination with this, then it's going to be you and me standing alone. It's the nature of people always to side with the underdog, so it's going to be you and me, and people would be pointing their finger at us and trying to sit there and say, well, you're being really harsh. Sure enough, it was just the two of us standing there, and we were criticized for it until they put a squash to the criticism. But the reality is, if you're going to be a leader and you have to go to termination, it will be a hard thing to do. And you know what? It should be a hard thing to do. You have to be able to deal with it and then get up the next morning and look at yourself in the mirror and say, did I do the right thing? That's a big deal. But you need to make certain you're dealing with the actions in the workplace and not attacking that person. If you do that, then looking in the mirror is no big deal. If you get joy in terminating people, you need to sit down and go take another class and dealing into why you have joy from hurting people. But the reality is sometimes you have to do the job, and the job is dealing with inappropriate behavior, but make sure you follow good, solid due process. Here are some ways of behavior modification. What you want, what the employee does, here's what you can do. Positive reinforcement, that works. Negative reinforcement, extinction, we can withhold rewards. Okay, we're going to reduce this over here until you straighten up, or punishment in the process. The bottom two are more difficult, but make sure you pay attention and that you're clear with your expectations. Don't let them say, well, I didn't know. No, your job is to sit there and make them know ahead of time. And then watch the behavior. Look at the positivity, look at the negative. Have you sit down and get rid of that behavior in the workplace? And then your goal is always to restore. Punishment, it depends what it is. Your job is to sit down there and make certain they're doing your job well. However you go about doing that. So positive reinforcement, punishment in the process, it all depends what you're doing. Use rewards to motivate, and you know what? Surprisingly, money is not the best motivator. If you reward somebody for doing their job that they're expected to do, why are you rewarding them? They should be doing that on a regular basis. Reward should be for extraordinarily good behavior and performance in the workplace. Don't give them extra money or rewards for just doing the work. I had an employee do that one time, and she was giving this bad employee positive reinforcement and memos in a personnel file, and then 3 months later she wanted to fire him. Well, I was talking to her, and she says, okay, I'm just trying to motivate him. I says, do not write any more positive memos. Stop it. Because if you want to terminate him like you did last year, then I have to sit down and build a case to overcome that. Don't do that. Look at the aspect of motivation. Compensation, a lot of times with extra compensation comes as an intrinsic reward, sitting there saying, you've really done a superb job, but that's for your top motivators in the aspect of they're doing a good job. So pay attention to what's happening. For working parents, sometimes flexibility is more important than money. It just depends what they're out there. You're looking at career opportunities to make certain that you have benefits and a positive reinforcement overall and reduce the stress on them. Sometimes in their personal lives, it depends what you have. Make certain that your compensation plan is really good, but then again, you're looking at equity, not necessarily motivation. Work-life balance, a lot of times people want some flexibility and a need for personal growth. Give them opportunities to grow in their profession as well as on the job. So it depends what you're doing, but reward in public, discipline in private, follow due process, look for positive reinforcement, and sometimes the positive reinforcement needs to be customized for each individual employee as well as the negative reinforcement. But do not sit down there and have that leach out into the actual community. That's personal between you and the supervisor. Sometimes if you're going to give a warning, I recommend having a witness during that meeting in the process, and that way you can document it so that you don't have two different stories. You have one story that's out there and you have backup on yours. Extinction, punishment, overall, the only one that can change your behavior is the employee, but you can certainly control the behavior in the workplace to make certain you are getting what's expected for that employee in the workplace and the kind of work they should be doing. Take care.